My name is Patience Thompson, born Bragg. I was the youngest child of William Lawrence Bragg and the granddaughter of W.H. Bragg, whom I just dimly remember. We have this bust of my father, which I absolutely love. It's a very, very good likeness. It moves and stirs me every time I see it.
William Henry and William Lawrence Bragg were the first father and son team to win a Nobel Prize for a discovery that shone a new light on the structure of our world. And it all started with an X-ray.
Most people know what an X-ray is, or they think of the shadowy photograph that they've seen of a broken leg or a broken arm. So they know that X-rays is a powerful, special type of light, and then it can pass through most forms of matter, and certainly can pass through biological tissue, but it's absorbed by bone, which is why it leaves a shadow.
In 1912, Max von Laue was firing X-rays at crystal samples and becoming intrigued by the patterns that were formed, but he couldn't make complete sense of what they meant. W.H. Bragg showed his son Lawrence these diffraction patterns.
Well, like everybody else, he saw a pattern of spots, but I think he also saw a puzzle, and a puzzle that needed to be solved.
He loved detective stories. That was his great thing. One of his great mortifications is that he once sat next to Agatha Christie at dinner and was introduced by her married name and didn't realise who she was. And my mother said afterwards, "You must have had a marvellous time sitting next to Agatha Christie." And he said, "What?"
Okay, so maybe Lawrence wouldn't have made a great detective, but when it came to piecing together scientific clues, it was a different matter.
He just looked at the problem in a completely different way to Laue, and he saw what the solution was.
He noticed things that other people didn't notice. I mean, everybody was looking at those Laue X-rays and trying to get an interpretation, typical of my father, to see that in fact a two-dimensional sheet could be transformed into a three-dimensional model. Ping-pong balls and rods.
So this is one of the very first diffraction patterns that the Braggs themselves would have taken, and it's taken from a crystal of salt. And so you can see the very particular pattern. Each of these spots represents the end of a diffracted ray, and it was their particular insight that showed us how to interpret this pattern in terms of the atomic structure within the crystal.
William Henry had been thinking of X-rays as particles. However, Lawrence suddenly had an insight about the nature of crystals themselves.
So what is it really that makes a thing a crystal? It's its inside arrangement. It's the fact that the molecules or atoms in it are in an absolutely regular pattern, like soldiers on parade or like the pattern of a wallpaper.
The atoms are arranged in layers or in two-dimensional planes that go all the way through the crystal. And so he realized that each one of these acts like a semi-transparent mirror. And so what's happening is that the X-ray is reflecting off the top layer, but also of the next layer underneath and of the layer underneath that. And the X-rays bounce off those planes in all sorts of directions. And by thinking of the problem simply as reflection, he was able to figure out how the atoms were arranged exactly and produce this model, in fact, which is the very first atomic structure of a crystalline sample that was ever solved.
He liked to make connections. He liked always to be building up a picture, increasing insight.
Scientists finally had the ability to look at the atomic structure of matter, and they could start to understand some of the physical properties of matter in terms of the underlying atomic structure. And that was an enormous breakthrough. He didn't realize probably at that stage how massive the breakthrough he'd just made had been.
His solution was almost always the simplest. Same in his watercolours, which is an almost professional ability to bring out the important things. And the same in his articles. He would give visual illustrations. It wasn't tell me, it was show me.
And it helped to explain why it is that these two forms of carbon have such different properties. So diamond is one of the hardest substances that we know of, and the atomic structure shows that that strength arises because the atoms are bonded to each other very closely and in all three directions. Whereas in graphite, you've got these close hexagonal nets But the whole structure is layered and they can slide easily past one another. Now, graphite is also a pure form of carbon, but it's much softer. That very softness arises from the fact that these layers are not tightly bonded to one another. And that was first revealed by X-ray crystallography.
Well, the great breakthrough on crystallography came when he was walking along the backs in Cambridge and suddenly had a blinding insight. But, I mean, it could be when he was doing the washing up. He didn't have to be in a rarefied atmosphere to have these ideas. You felt that his brain was working all the time and that he liked to have some problem to crunch on.
The Braggs' work on crystallography was disrupted during World War I, with Henry moving into submarine detection and Lawrence being sent to the front line. But their insights led to a shared Nobel Prize in 1915, with Lawrence becoming the youngest Nobel winner in history at just 25.
My father heard that he had won the Nobel Prize when he was in the trenches. He was obviously extremely chuffed and pleased, but I think the world was in such total disarray around him that it all must have seemed rather remote.
He now turned to using science to fight against the German army's superior weaponry.
The German army had the upper hand very often because they had much more powerful guns. And my father was asked to establish a system of working out by listening to the sounds and comparing how long it took them to get to various different points, exactly where the location of the guns were. In the obituaries on my father, it did say that his team shortened the war because they could put the enemy guns out of action.
Back in peacetime, the field of X-ray crystallography went from strength to strength. The discoveries by the Braggs and their successors kept coming, and the technique was used to solve increasingly complex structures such as graphite, penicillin, DNA, and more recently whole viruses. To date, crystallography has been a feature of 29 Nobel Prizes.
The application of this technique transformed our understanding of matter in so many different fields, not just in geology, understanding minerals, but in chemistry, understanding how different chemicals are built up, and then finally brought us into the realm of biology, where we could figure out how it is that the molecules that exist within us are coordinated and work together in order to sustain life. And these days, it's kind of a shame he's not with us now, because I think he would just be enormously impressed to see how the technique has even developed even since 1971. Just the size and the scale and ambition of the types of problems that people are tackling now. So whole virus particles have been crystallized and solved. We are simply getting better and better at doing crystallography. The Curiosity rover that NASA sent to Mars last year has got an X-ray diffraction instrument on the rover that's trundling over the surface. And so it can pick up samples of soil and it can analyze the minerals that are in the soil on Mars.
He liked Agatha Christie, I think, because in the last chapter everything falls into place. He liked neat endings.
It's still winning Nobel Prizes, and I don't see that slowing down.